The billionaire walked in quietly. The fiancée froze. But it was the maid's expression that revealed the truth. Harrison Vale had built his life on precision-measured risks, timed exits, flawless appearances, but nothing in his empire felt as fragile as the two small lives sleeping upstairs in the quiet mountain home he owned in Asheville, North Carolina. Evan and Caleb were barely old enough to understand the world, yet somehow, the world already felt heavy around them. Since their mother's death, the house had learned a new kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, the careful kind. Harrison's fiancée, Celeste Rowan, kept the home immaculate. Schedules were tight. Routines were strict. The twins were always clean, always quiet, always controlled. To outsiders, it looked like order. To Harrison, it felt like restraint. And then, there was Letitia Moore. She arrived every morning on the early bus from Spartanburg, South Carolina, quiet, respectful, invisible to most. She did not question authority. She did not insert herself into family matters. She simply watched the twins with a kind of attention that didn't come from training, but from instinct. She noticed how their breathing changed in certain rooms, how one twin clung while the other went stiff, how calm returned only when Celeste's voice left the air. Harrison noticed that too. So when he announced a long business trip, one that would take him away for weeks, he was not truly leaving. He was listening. He wanted to see who the house would become when power stepped out of the room. And in the quiet absence of the man who owned everything, truth began to rearrange itself. What would the house reveal when it believed no one was watching? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The Vale estate in Asheville stood like a monument to serenity, manicured lawns, cascading mountain views, and glass walls that let the golden afternoon light touch every surface. It was the kind of place where silence could sing, and everything looked like peace had settled in permanently. But looks can lie. Harrison Vale arrived with his twin boys, Evan and Caleb, under the guise of starting a quieter life, one where his past would no longer echo through every room. He moved through the halls with practiced steps, always just behind the sound of his children's laughter, never quite joining in. He watched more than he spoke now. His grief had gone still and quiet, like the mountain air present but heavy. Celeste, his fiancée, had taken the reins of the household before the first box was unpacked. With a clipboard in one hand and her phone never far from the other, she directed the staff with swift precision. Meal schedules, decor placements, nanny rotations, every detail passed through her. To an outsider, it might seem admirable. To those inside the house, it felt more like control wearing a smile. Letitia, the housekeeper, became the boys' quiet refuge. Though her role wasn't originally meant to include childcare, Evan and Caleb gravitated to her with instinctive trust. Her soft hums as she folded their clothes, the gentle way she guided their little hands during lunch, and the honest way she listened all made her presence feel like a safe harbor. The boys leaned into her without fear. Around her, they giggled. They shared. They shined. The house ran smoothly on the outside. But under the polished surfaces, the tension was building. Slow and invisible, like water soaking into wood. Celeste's tone was always sweet, but too often laced with correction. Harrison listened, but rarely responded, sometimes seeming miles away even while standing in the same room. He would watch the twins play in the sunroom, a soft smile flickering when Evan built towers out of blocks, or when Caleb ran his finger along the glass, tracing clouds. But he kept his distance. Letitia noticed. "Mr. Vale," she once asked gently, "do you ever join them?" His eyes didn't move from the boys. "They don't need me to play. Just to watch." She didn't press. Still, what unsettled her most wasn't Harrison's silence, but the twins' unease, a specific kind. It happened every time Celeste entered the room. Evan's shoulders would tighten. Caleb's eyes would dart toward the floor. Toys stopped moving. Voices hushed. Celeste never shouted, never scolded in front of others. But something about her presence, her perfume, her posture, maybe even the smile that never reached her eyes, shifted the atmosphere. Letitia began keeping mental notes. The patterns, the glances, the way Caleb clutched his brother's sleeve a little tighter when Celeste stood too close. The house was calm, yes, immaculate even, but something didn't feel right. And then one evening, as the twilight deepened over the mountain ridges and the twins lay in bed whispering to each other, Letitia paused outside their door. "She was looking at you again," Caleb whispered to Evan. "She doesn't like it when we laugh. Do you think she hears us now?" Letitia's heart dropped. She stepped away from the door, a chill crawling up her arms despite the warmth of the hall. The silence in this house was no accident. It was taught, expected. Peace can exist in appearance, while danger learns to stay quiet. She turned to head back downstairs when a sharp cry rang out from the boys' room. She froze. It wasn't a nightmare cry. It was the sound of fear. Why did the twins grow restless every time Celeste entered the room? It started with a scream, the kind that made Letitia drop her folded laundry and run heart-thudding, mind racing. Evan's cries pierced the stillness of the night like glass shattering in a cathedral. By the time she reached the nursery, he was sitting upright, clutching his blanket with trembling fists, his eyes wild and unfocused. She rushed to his side, wrapping him in her arms. "Shh, baby. It's okay. I'm here." Caleb stirred in the other bed, blinking sleepily. But his gaze didn't drift to his brother, it drifted to the hallway. He stared at the door. Letitia followed his gaze but saw nothing. It was the first time, but not the last. Over the next few nights, Evan's screams returned like clockwork. No fever, no night terrors he could explain, just jolts of terror that vanished with the sunrise. During the day, Caleb grew quieter, stiffer, especially when Celeste picked him up. He used to wrap his arms around her neck, now he barely touched her. His small body would go rigid in her embrace, his hands floating instead of gripping. Letitia saw it happen one morning when Celeste breezed in with a smile that didn't soften her eyes and scooped Caleb into her arms. He didn't cry, didn't fight, he just froze. Letitia said nothing at first, watching, waiting, noticing how both boys' chests rose faster when Celeste was in the room, breathing that no longer matched the calm their faces pretended to wear. She knew children could feel what adults tried to bury. Celeste caught her staring once and chuckled. "They're just overattached. Separation anxiety. It's common when they spend too much time with the help." Letitia smiled politely. But something in her stomach turned. That word, help. It wasn't just dismissive. It was distancing, as if love had a pay grade. Still, Letitia kept her tone even. "They don't act this way with anyone else." Celeste's smile thinned. "They'll grow out of it." But the twins weren't growing out of it, they were growing deeper into something. One evening, Harrison stood in the doorway longer than usual as Letitia read to the boys. Evan was curled at her side, Caleb tucked under her arm, both boys slack with comfort. Letitia glanced up, surprised to find Harrison watching so intently. He said nothing, just nodded, then turned and walked away. From that night on, she noticed a change in him. Subtle, quiet, but real. He started logging things. Notes on his phone. Glances scribbled in a journal she once saw half hidden beneath a stack of business briefs. He wasn't speaking on it, but he was watching. Letitia wasn't alone anymore. Still, nothing was visible. No bruises, no outbursts. Just a strange erosion like light dimming in a room where no one had turned the switch. And then came the afternoon when Caleb fell asleep in the playroom. Letitia, wiping down the toys nearby, watched as Celeste leaned in to lift him. The moment her fingers touched his back, Caleb flinched so hard he startled himself awake. His breath hitched. He blinked rapidly, eyes searching not for where he was, for who was touching him. Celeste laughed it off, brushing his hair. Letitia didn't laugh. She sat quietly with the boys that night, her hands folded tight in her lap. The echo of that reaction stuck in her chest. This wasn't just exhaustion, and this wasn't just about routine or grief. It was a pattern, one quiet enough to ignore, if you wanted to, but not quiet enough for God. God often speaks first through patterns, not events. Letitia stared at the ceiling long after the boys had gone to sleep, a question rising like smoke in the back of her mind. Is this just stress, or something far more intentional? Harrison stood behind the wall of glass in his Asheville office, staring down at the motion of the city. People moved like clockwork, predictable, mechanical, masked in purpose, just like he'd trained himself to be. The intercom buzzed softly. "Sir, your flight confirmation came through. Boston, then Houston, then Seattle. Thank you," he said, his voice unreadable. When he finally turned from the window, the decision had been made. He would leave, but only physically. The rest of him would remain, watching from places Celeste wouldn't see. That afternoon, he gathered everyone in the family wing. Celeste stood with her usual composed smile, her hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder. Evan sat on Letitia's lap, thumbing the edge of his shirt. "I'll be away for 10 days, Harrison said evenly. 3 cities, multiple investors." Letitia blinked. "So soon?" Harrison nodded. "The boys will remain here, of course. Celeste will assume primary authority over their schedule while I'm gone." Celeste's smile widened, gracious, perhaps too gracious. "I trust you'll keep things calm and consistent," Harrison added, his eyes locking with hers. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "You don't have to worry." But he wasn't done. "I'll be limiting direct communication while I travel. High security meetings. Minimal access. Any real emergencies can go through the estate's legal liaison." A pause filled the room. Letitia's brow creased, just slightly. The boys didn't move. Celeste's hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll check in when I can," he finished, then bent to kiss each boy's forehead. The next morning, he left, but not without reinforcing what she didn't know. Discreet surveillance protocols, access to time-stamped footage, and a quiet agreement with the estate's head of security. Nothing invasive, just eyes, because this was no vacation. It was a test, one Celeste would never know she was taking. Letitia, for her part, moved through the following days without realizing the rules had shifted. She noticed only the weight of Celeste's presence, thickening like smoke in a closed room. Bedtimes were stricter. Playtime was shortened. The warmth of routine turned cold. Celeste began using phrases like discipline structure and emotional boundaries when speaking to Letitia. She started correcting the twins for things as small as whispering too long at dinner or leaving toys unstacked. Smiles were now performances, applause expected. Letitia tried not to interfere, she wasn't in charge. But her stomach sank every time Evan flinched at a sharp tone, or when Caleb's eyes flicked to her for safety before speaking. Still, Celeste insisted all was fine. "They need shaping," she said one evening, sipping tea. "You're too soft on them." Letitia looked at the boys across the room, backs straight, voices quiet, joy absent. "Children need softness," she said quietly. "Especially after loss." Celeste didn't reply. She didn't need to. In Harrison's absence, she moved like the queen of a silent kingdom. But Letitia began to wonder. Who exactly was Celeste when no one was looking? Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Harrison reviewed a video clip on his encrypted tablet. Evan, reaching for a toy, saying something he couldn't hear, and the way Evan's shoulders curled inward, like a flame retreating from wind. He paused the video, rewound, watched again. No visible harm, but visible fear. He didn't type a single note this time. He didn't need to. The patterns were beginning to speak louder than any single act could. When authority retreats, truth steps forward. The truth was stepping forward now. And as the days passed, the boys spoke less, laughed less, and their once bright spirits dulled like overused chalk. Letitia watched. Harrison watched. Only Celeste seemed blind to the atmosphere curdling behind her own reflection, because in her mind, the crown was finally hers. But what will Celeste become when she believes power is finally hers? It started with a voice, not loud, not harsh, just wrong. Letitia paused in the staff corridor one afternoon, her arms full of folded linens, when she heard Celeste's voice behind the closed door of the boys' room. Not yelling, not scolding, but a sharpness beneath the surface that froze Letitia mid-step. "You will sit still while I'm speaking, Evan." "Caleb, look at me." not the floor. Her tone was precise. Every word clipped, surgically calm. Too calm. Letitia waited, heart drumming. She heard no crying, no protests, just a long silence that made the house itself feel like it was holding its breath. When Celeste finally emerged, her expression was untouched, as if nothing had happened. The door clicked shut behind her. She saw Letitia and smiled as though she hadn't just sliced through the air with her voice. "The boys are napping," she said lightly. "They're finally learning to listen." Letitia nodded politely, forcing a smile. But when she went in to check, she found no nap. Evan was curled on his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Caleb sat in the corner by the window, knees pulled to his chest, whispering softly to himself. No tears, no visible bruises. But something was missing, some piece of childhood that had been carefully removed while no one was watching. It happened again the next day. And the next, always when the boys were alone with Celeste. Always behind closed doors. Always followed by stillness. Letitia began to document. She took notes in a small, leather-bound journal she kept hidden in her apron pocket. A chart formed slowly. Time alone with Celeste. Emotional aftermath. Sleep patterns. Appetite changes. She tracked the growing distance between the boys' laughter and their daily lives. How Evan now jumped at sudden sounds. How Caleb began chewing his sleeves again, a habit he'd dropped months ago. At night, Letitia lay awake, replaying every detail in her mind. She had no proof. Just atmosphere. Just the way Evan flinched when Celeste walked too close. Just the hollow way Caleb's voice sounded when he said, "I'm fine," even though no one had asked. Fear grew. Quiet, but persistent. She picked up her phone one evening, stepped into the laundry room, and called the only person who'd always known how to interpret silence. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Baby girl?" Letitia exhaled. Her voice cracked. "Mama, I need you to pray." "What's wrong?" Letitia glanced toward the hallway, then whispered, "Something's not right here. With the twins, it's not big things. But they're scared. And I don't know what's happening when I'm not in the room." Her mother didn't ask for details. Didn't need them. "Prayer's already started," she said simply. "You trust what the Spirit's telling you, Letitia. You hear through the quiet. That's a gift." Letitia wiped her eyes. "But I don't have anything I can show. It's all just feelings. Looks. The way they breathe when she's around." Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "When fear has no name, faith becomes its language. Keep watching. Keep listening. The truth don't hide forever." Letitia hung up, steadied herself, and returned to the nursery. The boys were asleep finally, but even in their sleep, their little faces looked tense, like dreams had become something they had to survive. She brushed a hand over Caleb's curls and whispered a silent prayer. The next day, she saw Celeste holding Caleb's hand in the garden. From a distance, it looked sweet like affection, but the way Caleb's fingers twitched in hers, like he was resisting, but didn't dare pull away. Letitia wrote it down, and watched again that night, as Evan refused to eat, pushing food around his plate until Celeste raised an eyebrow, and then he stuffed the whole bite in his mouth without chewing. No shouting, no bruises, but something was happening when no one with power was watching. What exactly is happening when no one with power is watching? The estate was silent when Harrison Vale returned. No chauffeur, no announcement. Just the soft purr of his black sedan rolling into the driveway under the cover of night. He had moved through the house like a shadow, bypassing the security system with his own code, and stepping into a home that felt colder than when he'd left it. He didn't go to his room. His feet carried him without thinking to the family wing, to the boys' room. It was nearly midnight, but the door was slightly ajar. A thin slice of light bled into the hallway, and what he heard before seeing anything stopped him dead in his tracks. Evan was crying, not whining, not fussing, but crying deep, raw sobs that tore through the quiet like something broken. Inside the room, Celeste stood near the twin beds, arms crossed, her voice firm and low. "You will settle down now, Evan. This is unacceptable." Caleb sat hunched in the corner of his bed, his little arms wrapped around his legs, shoulders trembling as he clung to the edge of his blanket like it could shield him from her voice. "You're doing this to yourselves," Celeste said coldly. "There's no reason for this behavior." Letitia hovered by the doorway, heart racing, face pale. She took a step forward. "Ma'am, maybe they just need—" Celeste raised a hand, without even looking back. "They need structure, not coddling." Letitia froze, her eyes shifting to Evan, whose sobs had turned breathless, his small chest rising too fast. Caleb didn't speak, but the look in his eyes, wide, wet, locked on. Letitia said everything. Then the atmosphere changed. Celeste turned, perhaps sensing movement behind her. Her expression froze. Harrison was standing in the doorway. No words, no emotion, just watching. His eyes swept across the room to Evan's crumpled figure on the bed, to Caleb's silent fear, to Letitia's helplessness, and finally to Celeste. Her entire demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. "Oh," she gasped, stepping back. Her voice softened, turned syrupy. "Harrison, I didn't hear you come in. They've just had a rough evening, and—" He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He looked at her like she was someone he didn't know. Celeste moved toward him, hands open in a practiced gesture of control. "I've done everything I could, but they're becoming so emotional lately. You understand?" He still said nothing. Letitia didn't move, barely dared to breathe. Harrison stepped fully into the room. His eyes fell on Evan, who had stopped crying only because his breath had run out. Then on Caleb, who had not stopped shaking. Then back to Celeste. The air was thick, the silence full of weight. The truth does not shout when discovered. It waits. And now, it waited on him. Harrison turned and walked out. He didn't say a single word. Celeste stood frozen in place, her smile faltering. Letitia scooped Evan into her arms the moment the door clicked shut behind him, whispering soft words, rocking his tiny frame. Caleb crawled to her side and leaned in silently. Whatever just happened had cracked something open, but not enough to spill out what came next. Celeste stared at the closed door, eyes narrowing. Letitia held the boys close. And upstairs, Harrison sat in his study, staring at nothing, no longer reading notes, no longer needing cameras. He had seen it, now that he has seen it himself. What will Harrison do with the truth? The suitcase sat by the door for less than an hour. It wasn't packed with ceremony. Only necessity: a few folded shirts, a worn Bible, and the journal Letitia had carried tucked against her heart like a secret. No one cried when she left. No one spoke above a whisper. The house seemed almost relieved to breathe without her presence. She'd been accused of interference. The word clung to her like soot. "Overstepping boundaries," Celeste had said with that quiet, calculated tone. "I understand she's emotionally invested, but that's exactly the problem. The boys are confused by the imbalance." Harrison had listened. Just listened. And then, without protest, he allowed Letitia to be dismissed quietly, discreetly. No scene, no warning. Part of the test. But tests often feel like betrayals to the ones being tested. Letitia sat on the bus ride to Spartanburg in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked on the window but seeing nothing. The Blue Ridge Mountains faded behind her, replaced by the gray wash of open road. She had failed. That's what it felt like. She'd left them behind. She'd let fear win. By the time the bus pulled into the Spartanburg terminal, the sun had slipped behind a line of clouds. Her mother was waiting, wrapped in her favorite maroon shawl, arms already open before Letitia even stepped off the last stair. They embraced without words. At home, Letitia sat at the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the walls covered in memories, school photos, choir ribbons, a prayer banner she'd once made in Sunday school. But none of it could quiet the sound of Evan crying, or the way Caleb had clung to her arm that last morning, like he knew she wouldn't be coming back. Her mother didn't ask for details. She simply brought a warm blanket and sat beside her on the floor. Together, they bowed their heads. There were no grand declarations, no fiery prayers, just silence and tears, and faith pressed between them, like a whisper passed from one heart to another. Obedience often looks like loss before it looks like protection. Letitia didn't know if she'd been obedient. She didn't know if staying quiet was wisdom or weakness. But something inside her shifted as her tears fell, not rage, not defiance, but resolve. She couldn't stay silent forever. Those boys were too small to fight for themselves. And she knew what she'd seen. Maybe not in proof the world would accept, but in patterns heaven had confirmed. The next morning, she pulled her journal from her bag and reread every entry. Each note, each timestamp, every change in breath and silence and posture. She wrote one new line at the bottom of the last page. If I was wrong, peace would have stayed. She closed the journal slowly and looked out the window toward the oak tree that had stood in her mother's yard since before she was born. It had weathered storms, lost branches, and kept growing. Maybe she could too. But how? She had no platform, no position, no power. She was just a maid, dismissed, forgotten. The boys were still under Celeste's care. And Harrison, who'd seen it, who'd witnessed it, had yet to speak a word. Letitia stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter as a question burned in her chest like fire trying to become light. How can a dismissed maid stand against a future billionaire's wife? Letitia had not expected to return, so when the black car pulled up in front of her mother's house, unannounced but unmistakably from the Vale estate, she stood frozen at the screen door, clutching her apron with both hands. The driver stepped out with a sealed envelope. No note inside. Just a name, a time, and a request. Harrison Vale would like to see you. Alone. She didn't speak on the drive back to Asheville. Her palms were damp. Her pulse stayed high. What could this be now? Another dismissal? A warning? An accusation? But when the doors to Harrison's private study opened, everything was quiet. He stood near the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, the other holding a small leather-bound book, hers. Letitia stepped in, not meeting his eyes at first. She placed her copy of the journal, the original, gently on the table between them. Its edges were worn, corners frayed. Her testimony in ink. I don't know what you're expecting me to say, she began softly, but I wrote everything I saw. Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't interrupt. He just reached slowly into his desk drawer and pulled out his own file, typed, dated, and bookmarked. He laid it open beside her journal, line by line, entry by entry. Silence wrapped the room as Harrison flipped pages, matching timestamps with his own private surveillance notes. Comparing mood shifts, behavioral markers, and his memory of the night he returned home unannounced. Letitia stood still, hands folded tightly. Then came the moment. Evan's withdrawal. Caleb's flinches. The notes Harrison had logged after each business trip. His recollection of how the twins seemed brighter when Celeste was away and duller when she returned. They aligned, perfectly. A cold sort of stillness settled between them, not of doubt, but of clarity. She didn't hit them, Harrison finally said, his voice low. No, Letitia replied. She didn't scream. She didn't leave marks. No, sir, but the damage was there. Letitia nodded. In their silence. In the way they shrank when she entered a room. That kind of fear doesn't come from noise. It comes from being controlled. Until you can't recognize yourself anymore. Harrison looked down at the two sets of notes, hers written in worried cursive, his in methodical lines. Different hands. Same truth. The night I walked in, he said slowly, I knew something was wrong. But I told myself I didn't have enough. And now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her fully, directly. Now I know I have more than enough. They sat in the silence. Not as employer and staff, but as two people, standing at the same crossroad. This wasn't coincidence. This was confirmation. And with it came the quiet shift of responsibility from question to action. Down the hallway, the twins were with a temporary caregiver. Harrison had wanted them away from the room, away from the weight of this moment. But as if pulled by invisible strings, Caleb peeked his head around the study door. Evan followed, clinging to his brother's shirt. The moment they saw Letitia, their faces broke open in recognition. They ran to her without hesitation, without fear. And Harrison watched it unfold not as evidence, but as undeniable truth. No fear, no flinching, only safety. only love. The decision made itself in that moment. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of denial. There were no press conferences, no tabloid whispers, no late-night shouting matches, no shattered heirlooms in the foyer. The end came with a signature and a handshake, not between lovers, but between two people who now stood on opposite ends of a truth one of them refused to see. Harrison ended the engagement privately, calmly. Celeste had expected a conversation, a chance to explain, to deny. Instead, she found herself seated in a quiet legal office downtown. Harrison's legal counsel slid a non-disclosure and separation agreement across the table. The terms were clean, fair, unmistakable. "This is how it ends?" she asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Celeste left the Asheville estate the following morning. Her suitcases were already packed by the staff. Her exit was timed for privacy. No media in sight. No rumors sparked. Letitia watched the car pull away from the side window. She said nothing, just held Caleb on her hip and gently stroked Evan's hair as he leaned against her side. The boys didn't wave goodbye. They didn't ask where Celeste went. They only exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for far too long. Weeks passed, and slowly, carefully, the process of healing began. Harrison enrolled Evan and Caleb in a trauma-informed child development center in Hendersonville, one where therapists specialized in helping children untangle invisible knots left by emotional stress. The sessions focused on nervous system regulation, sensory play, breath work, safe expression. It wasn't easy. Some nights, Evan still woke up crying. Some afternoons, Caleb still flinched at sudden footsteps. But little by little, their shoulders dropped. Their laughter returned, first in whispers, then in full sound. Harrison didn't force closeness. He didn't try to fix what couldn't be rushed. Instead, he sat with them during therapy sessions, showed up, listened, let them lead. There was no speech that made things whole again. There was only presence. And presence, at last, was enough. One crisp morning, Letitia received a folded letter in the study. Inside were two things: a deed to a modest home on the outskirts of Asheville, hers, fully paid, and a scholarship voucher for early childhood development, should she want to pursue formal certification. She cried without words, and Harrison simply said, "You didn't just protect them. You taught me how." She moved into her new home quietly, bringing only the things that mattered: a small prayer cloth from her mother, the journal that had helped uncover the truth, and two framed photos of the twins that now sat on her kitchen counter like family. She called her mother that night. "They're safe now," she said softly. "Then so are you," her mother replied. There was no parade, no glossy headlines declaring justice. There was only routine, stability, safety, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to prove it exists, it just does. Some evenings, Letitia visited the center in Hendersonville, sitting in the parent lounge as Evan painted in blues and Caleb stacked blocks with careful fingers. Harrison would sit beside her sometimes, watching without needing to control, finally learning how to be still with his sons. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing, and that was more than enough. Not every rescue feels like victory. Some feel like the quiet relief of survival. The storm had passed, and in its place was something soft, still, safe.